my husband stood in the doorway of our kitchen on a Tuesday morning in November, holding his coffee mug the way he always did, with both hands, like he was clutching something precious, and he looked at me and said, "Norma, be honest with yourself. You wouldn't last 6 months without me running things." Our son Curtis was sitting right there at the breakfast table. He kept his eyes down and stirred his oatmeal like he hadn't heard a word. I was 63 years old. I had spent 31 years cooking in that kitchen, and I stood there holding a dish towel, and I said nothing. That was the part I still wrestle with. I said absolutely nothing. His name was my husband, Gerald. No, wait. Let me start properly the way things actually were, not the way I wish they'd been. His name was my husband, Roland Fitch. And for 31 years, I believed that loving someone quietly was the same thing as loving them well. I met Roland when I was 29 and teaching pottery classes out of a rented studio on the east side of Halifax, Nova Scotia. He came in one Saturday afternoon with a friend who'd dragged him along as a joke. Roland was the kind of man who filled a room without trying. Broad shoulders, easy laugh, the sort of confidence that felt generous back then, like he was sharing it with you. He sat down at the wheel and got clay absolutely everywhere, and laughed so hard at himself that I laughed too, and I thought, oh, this one. We married 14 months later in a small ceremony in my mother's backyard, delphiniums everywhere. I remember the smell of them, sweet and faintly spicy, and Roland squeezing my hands at the altar, and I thought this was the beginning of everything. For a while, it was. We bought a house in Dartmouth. Roland worked in commercial insurance. Steady work, good income. I kept teaching my pottery classes 3 mornings a week and spent the rest of my time building what I thought was a partnership. Then our son Curtis was born, and everything shifted in the way it shifts when children arrive. Gradually, quietly, until one morning you look up and realize the ground beneath you has changed completely. Roland suggested I stop teaching. Just temporarily, he said. Curtis was colicky, and the scheduling was complicated, and really, didn't it make more sense for one of us to be fully present? I agreed. It sounded reasonable. It was reasonable. And then reasonable became permanent without either of us ever saying so out loud. I told myself I'd go back to the studio eventually. I didn't. Instead, I became the person who remembered everything. Dentist appointments, parent-teacher nights, the exact day we needed to renew the house insurance. Which of Roland's colleagues was allergic to shellfish when I planned the Christmas dinner? I ran our household like a small, quiet business and received no salary and no title, and after a while, no real acknowledgement that it was work at all. Roland called himself the provider. At first, that was just a word. Then it became a worldview. The shift happened so slowly I can barely point to a single moment. But I remember one specific evening, Curtis was maybe 12, when I mentioned I'd been thinking about reopening a studio. Maybe something small. Maybe just on weekends. Roland looked at me over his reading glasses the way he did when something mildly inconvenient was being proposed. You haven't taught in what, 10 years? Who's going to... I said I didn't know yet. That I'd figure it out. He made a sound. Not cruel, exactly. Dismissive in the way that's worse than cruelty because you can't argue with it. Then he went back to his book. I didn't bring it up again. That's the part nobody talks about. How many times you swallow something, how many small surrenders pile up before you even realize they've built a wall around you. By the time I was 60, I couldn't remember the last time I'd made a decision about my own life without first calculating how Roland would react to it. I shopped carefully, justified my purchases, kept receipts. I arranged my days around his schedule. I apologized for things that weren't my fault simply to keep the temperature of the house livable. And I told myself, this was just marriage. This was just what long marriages looked like from the inside. Then came the November morning and the dish towel and Curtis staring at his oatmeal, and Roland saying, "You wouldn't last 6 months without me running things. 6 months." Like I was a small experiment he'd already predicted the outcome of. Curtis was 31 by then. He and his wife Amber had come for the weekend. Amber was polished and careful in the way people become when they've learned that one person in a room sets the temperature, and the safest thing to do is not disturb it. She'd figured Roland out within the first year of knowing him. I'd watched her do it, watched her make herself pleasant and non-threatening, and I understood completely because I had done the same thing for 3 decades. After Roland left for the office that morning, Amber came and stood beside us at me. She touched my arm. Just briefly. The way you touch someone when you don't quite know what to say. He worries about you, she said. That's how he thinks of it. I looked at her. Does he? She glanced toward the doorway. He tells people you've never really had to manage anything on your own. Something cold moved through me. What people? Amber's face shifted. She'd said too much, and she knew it. At his office dinners, she said quietly. He introduces you as... He says you've been looked after your whole marriage. Looked after. Like I was a houseplant. Like 31 years of invisible labor was a form of charity he'd extended to me. I finished the dishes. I thanked Amber for telling me, and that night, after they drove back to Moncton, I sat at the kitchen table for a very long time listening to the house settle around me, thinking about what she'd said. I started paying attention after that, not in a paranoid way, in the quiet, careful way you pay attention when you finally understand that something has been happening around you for years and you simply weren't looking at it directly. How Roland handled our finances. I'd always known the broad strokes: mortgage, investments, retirement accounts, but the details had always belonged to him. I'd sign things when he put them in front of me. I'd trusted him the way you trust someone you've shared a bed with for 30 years. What I found, when I finally looked, unsettled me in a way I wasn't prepared for. There was an investment account in Roland's name only. The balance was significant. Over $240,000. I found the statements tucked inside a file folder in his home office, behind a labeled tab that said automotive insurance. Historical, not hidden dramatically. Just placed somewhere I would never think to look because I'd never had reason to. I sat on the floor of his office for a long time. Then I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it. I didn't confront Roland. Not yet! Instead, I called my oldest friend, a woman named Philippa Ossie, who had moved to Toronto 15 years earlier, and who I'd spoken to less and less as Roland had made his feelings about my friendships quietly, persistently clear. Not through outright prohibition. Through commentary. She's a bit much, isn't she? You always seem drained after you see her. Until eventually I'd stopped seeing her as often, then stopped entirely, and convinced myself it was just geography. Philippa picked up on the second ring. When I heard her voice, I started crying before I'd said a single word. She listened for over an hour. Then she said, "Norma, you need to talk to someone who understands what's actually yours." 2 weeks later, I was sitting in the office of a family law solicitor named Isabel Tremblay in downtown Halifax. The waiting room had a cactus on the windowsill and a watercolor of the Cabot Trail on the wall, and I sat there gripping my own hands, thinking I had no idea how much any of this was going to cost, or where I would get the money to pay for it. Isabel Tremblay was in her early 50s with very short gray hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she had the quality of someone who had heard every version of this particular story, and still found it worth paying attention to. She asked me direct questions. She wrote things down. She did not look at me with pity. A stay-at-home spouse in a long-term marriage has significant legal recognition in Nova Scotia, she told me. Your contributions are part of the marital estate. This is not a gray area. I stared at her. No one has said that to me before. She looked up from her notepad. It's remarkable how often that's the case. She gave me a list. Tax returns, property documents, investment records, insurance policies. Do not remove anything, she said. Simply gather information. I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Not happy, not safe, but clear. Like a window that had been filmed over with grime, suddenly wiped clean. I spent the next 3 weeks being someone Roland had never imagined I could be. Quiet, observant, systematic. I photographed documents while he showered. I wrote down account numbers. I found 2 more statements, one for a registered account, one for something that appeared to be connected to a property transaction I had no memory of. One evening, Roland came home and found me at the kitchen table with my reading glasses on, looking at something on my laptop. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Just reading," I said. He looked at the screen. It was a recipe blog. I'd had it open on top of everything else. "You look tired," he said, and went to pour himself a drink. That was the night I understood something important. Roland's certainty about me, his absolute conviction that I was manageable, legible, predictable, was the thing I could use. Men who believe they've already won stop watching carefully. And I had spent 31 years making sure he had no reason to doubt that. But I want to tell you about the afternoon I went up to the spare room to look for a box of old sweaters, and found something else entirely. In the closet, behind winter coats and a broken humidifier, were 3 large plastic tubs I'd packed away years ago. I opened the first one. Winter scarves, a crocheted blanket I'd forgotten I'd made. I opened the second. Curtis's old school projects, a finger painting he'd done at age 5 that I'd kept without telling anyone. The third tub had my pottery tools. I stood there holding a wooden rib tool, the kind you use to shape the inside of a bowl, and something in my chest cracked open in a way I hadn't expected. The wood was still smooth in exactly the places my palm had worn it. My hands remembered it before my brain did. At the bottom of the tub, wrapped in an old tea towel, was a small glazed bowl I'd made years before Curtis was born. Deep blue-green, slightly uneven at the rim the way handmade things are. I'd given it to my mother, and she'd given it back to me when she moved into assisted living. And somehow I'd packed it away in this tub and forgotten it existed. I turned it over in my hands and thought about the woman who made this. 27 years old, still teaching, still believing that making things with your hands was a legitimate way to spend a life. I took the bowl downstairs and put it on the kitchen windowsill. Roland came home, looked at it, said nothing. That felt like something. I wasn't entirely sure what. I called Philippa that night. I found my pottery tools, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What are you going to do with them?" I didn't have an answer yet, but something had started moving in me that I didn't want to stop. A week later, I drove to a community arts center in Dartmouth that I'd passed 100 times without stopping. I walked in and asked about studio rental. A young woman with paint-stained hands told me they rented wheel time on weekday mornings to community members. $30 for a 2-hour session. I booked one for the following Thursday. I didn't tell Roland. I want to describe what it felt like to sit down at a wheel for the first time in over 2 decades, but I'm not sure I have adequate words for it. My hands were stiff. My first 3 attempts collapsed. The clay knew things my body had forgotten, and my body was slowly, stubbornly remembering them. The instructor, a young man named Oscar who was at most 25, and had the gentle patience of someone born to teach, came and stood beside me after my 3rd failure. "Your hands are fighting each other," he said. Not unkindly. "One's trying to control, one's trying to feel. You have to let them agree." I thought about that for longer than he probably intended. By the end of the 2-hour session, I had made one small lopsided cup. It leaned to the left. It would never hold coffee without tipping. But I had made it, and my hands had remembered how, and I sat there looking at it with something I can only describe as grief mixed with relief. Oscar asked if I wanted to book another session. "Yes," I said. "Every Thursday." I went back the following week, and the week after that. I didn't tell Roland where I was going. I said I was going to the library, which was technically true. I stopped there afterward to give the story legs. At home, nothing changed outwardly. I made Roland's meals. I kept the house. I smiled at the appropriate times. But underneath that, something was solidifying. I was 6 weeks into my Thursday sessions when Roland came home one evening and told me, over dinner, that he was thinking of retiring in the spring. "I'll need you to be available," he said. "I'm going to want to travel. Do some golf." I looked at him across the table. "Available! I don't want to be waiting around for you to finish errands or whatever." Errands. That was my life. Errands. I said I'd keep that in mind. That night I lay awake for a long time. Not upset exactly. Thinking. Roland was planning the next 20 years of his life with me as a support figure in it, a warm presence with no needs of her own, and he had not once, not one single time, asked me what I wanted the next 20 years to look like. The following morning I called Isabel Tremblay's office and made an appointment. "I think I'm ready," I told the receptionist. "Ready for what?" she asked politely. "To move forward." The months that followed were the hardest and the strangest of my life. Isabel was methodical and unflappable. Roland's initial response to the divorce papers was disbelief. Then irritation, then a cold, controlled fury that reminded me of a thermostat that only registers in one direction. "You have no idea what this costs," he told me one evening, still in the same house because we hadn't sorted the living arrangements. "Lawyers, court fees. Do you have any concept of what this process costs?" "I'm beginning to understand finances better," I said. He stared at me like I'd said something in a foreign language. Isabel's team uncovered the full picture over the following weeks. The hidden investment account. A property outside Truro that Roland had sold 3 years earlier without mentioning it to me. My name was not on the transaction. My name, it turned out, was not on several things it should have been on. And in 2 instances, Isabel found something that made her set down her pen very carefully before she spoke. "There are signatures on these documents attributed to you," she said. "I'd like you to look at them." I looked. My name, in handwriting that was close to mine but not quite. Not the slant of my S, not the way I make a capital N. "I didn't sign these," I said. Isabel looked at me steadily. "I know." The room was quiet for a long moment. "What does that mean?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. "It means this may be considerably more serious than a standard division of assets." I drove home in a kind of controlled numbness. I kept both hands on the wheel and watched the highway and thought about every piece of paper I'd ever signed for Roland. Every document he'd put in front of me with his pen already uncapped. Just the standard stuff. Don't worry about the details. I had trusted him, completely, for 31 years, and he had counted on that. I didn't fall apart that night. I was surprised to discover this. I'd spent so long bracing for the moment, everything collapsed that when it arrived I simply sat with it, turned it over, understood it, and then made a cup of tea. What I felt was not grief. Not anymore. It was something colder and more useful. Clarity. Curtis came to Halifax the following weekend. He didn't call first. I opened the door, and he was standing on the front step in the rain, and I could see from his face that Amber had told him something, or Roland had, or he'd simply put pieces together the way adult children eventually do when they stop protecting themselves from the truth. "Can I come in?" he asked. We sat in the kitchen. He'd grown a beard since I'd last seen him, and it made him look older. And for a strange moment I saw Roland in him. Not the Roland I was divorcing, but the Roland from early on, the one who had laughed at himself in my pottery class. It hurt in a complicated way. "Amber said there might be legal stuff," Curtis said carefully. "There is!" He rubbed his hands on his knees. "She said it's serious." "It is." Curtis looked at the blue-green bowl on the windowsill. He'd noticed it when he came in but hadn't said anything. Now he looked at it properly. "That's from your old studio," he said. "Yes." He was quiet. "Then I didn't know you still had your tools. I found them." He looked at me. Something moved across his face, not quite guilt, but adjacent to it. The look of someone who is recalculating a long-held assumption. "Dad said you left all that behind voluntarily," he said quietly. "He always made it sound like it was your choice." I held my mug with both hands. "It's complicated how choices work," I said finally. "When someone spends years making sure you only see 2 options, and one of them always happens to be theirs." Curtis stared at the table for a long moment. Then he said, "I laughed when he said things sometimes." "About you? I know, I shouldn't have. You were his son. It's hard to know what's normal when it's inside your own house." He looked up at me with eyes that were red at the rims. "I'm sorry, Mum." I reached over and put my hand on his. "I know you are." We sat there for a while without talking, which was more honest than anything we could have said. 6 months after the papers were filed, I moved into a small apartment in Dartmouth. 2nd floor, 2 bedrooms, a window over the street where I could watch people walking dogs in the evenings. It was modest and quiet, and nothing in it belonged to Roland's vision of our life. The first night alone, I cried for about an hour. Real crying, not polite crying, the kind that leaves your face swollen and your chest aching and you have to sit on the bathroom floor until it passes. I cried for my younger self. For the studio I'd closed. For the years I'd spent making myself small enough to fit inside someone else's idea of what I should be. Then I washed my face, made tea, and looked out the window for a while. The next morning I went to Thursday pottery. I had been renting wheel time at the art center for 4 months by then, and Oscar had started letting me use the kiln. I'd made 17 pieces, most of them flawed, several of them surprisingly not. A set of 3 small bowls in a dark slate glaze that a woman in another class had seen drying on the shelf and asked if they were for sale. I'd said I didn't think so. She'd given me her card anyway. Her name was Miriam Adesola, and she owned a shop in downtown Halifax that sold handmade goods and local art. "When you change your mind," she'd said, "call me." I thought about that card often in those early weeks alone. I was living off the temporary support arrangement Isabel had secured, which was adequate but not comfortable, and the divorce settlement was still months away. Every time I bought groceries, I tallied the cost without thinking, a habit so deep in me by then it happened automatically. One Thursday morning, 3 weeks after moving into the apartment, I packed the 3 slate bowls into a cardboard box and drove to Miriam Adesola's shop. Miriam was shorter than I'd remembered, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She unwrapped the bowls from the tissue I'd packed them in and held each one up to the light from the front window. "These are good," she said simply. "I haven't sold work in a very long time," I told her. "How long? Over 20 years. She looked at me steadily. "Why did you stop?" I thought about how to answer that. I let someone convince me it wasn't practical. Miriam made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. "How much do you want for them?" I named a number that felt embarrassingly low. She named one twice as high and said she'd take a 30% commission. I stood there doing the arithmetic and trying not to look as stunned as I felt. She shook my hand. "Bring me more when you have them." I drove back to my apartment and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes, and then I did something I hadn't done in years. I called Philippa in Toronto and told her what had happened, and she screamed so loudly I had to hold the phone away from my ear, and I laughed. Really laughed. For the first time in longer than I could accurately remember. The bowls sold within 2 weeks. Miriam texted me a photograph of the empty shelf with a single thumbs-up emoji. I made more. I want to be clear about something. This is not a story about becoming instantly successful. It wasn't like that. I made pieces slowly, carefully, often badly. I wasted clay. I made things that came out of the kiln looking nothing like what I'd intended. There was a Thursday in February when I drove to the arts center in a snowstorm and sat at the wheel for an hour and couldn't make anything work and went home and sat in my coat in my kitchen and cried again. And this time the crying had a different quality. Less grief, more frustration, which is actually a better sign than it sounds. But the pieces that worked. And Miriam kept selling them. By spring, I had a small regular arrangement with the shop, 10 to 15 pieces a month. It wasn't a living wage. But it was mine. Numbers I'd earned, money that landed in an account with only my name on it. And the first time I saw that balance, I sat in front of my laptop for a long time just looking at it. Roland found out I was selling work through Curtis, who mentioned it without thinking. He called me that evening. "I heard you're doing pottery," he said, the way he said it, like someone describing a child's hobby. "Selling through some shop?" "Yes." A pause. "How much are you making from that?" "Enough," I said. He laughed, the short, dismissive kind. "Norma, come on, you're not going to support yourself on craft sales at 63. I thought about Miriam texting me a photo of an empty shelf. I thought about the account with only my name on it. I thought about sitting on the bathroom floor crying in November and driving through a snowstorm to make things I couldn't manage to make, and going back the following Thursday anyway. "I'll let you know how it goes," I said, and ended the call. He showed up at the arts center one Saturday morning, in April. I didn't know he was coming. No one had told him my schedule, which meant he'd simply found it. That small detail, him knowing where I was, without my telling him, sent a current of unease through me that I chose to stand still inside, rather than let show. He came in while I was at the wheel, hands covered in clay, working on a tall vase form that I was quite pleased with. He stood near the door and looked around through the studio with the particular expression he used when surveying something he'd already decided didn't quite meet his standards. "Can we talk?" he said. Oscar was on the other side of the studio demonstrating a centering technique to 2 students. A couple of people at wheels nearby had glanced over. "I'm in the middle of something," I said. "I can wait." He did. He sat in a plastic chair near the door for 40 minutes while I finished the vase and set it carefully on the drying shelf and washed my hands and took off my apron. I was aware the whole time of people watching. Not intrusively, but the way you're aware of witnesses, the way their presence changes the weight of things. Roland stood when I walked toward him. He looked tired in a way I hadn't noticed before. Not physically. Roland had always been physically well-maintained. But something behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. "This isn't going to work," he said, meaning the divorce, meaning my attempt at independence, meaning all of it. "It's already working," I said. He glanced around the studio. You're doing pottery classes. I'm making work for a gallery. Something shifted in his face. A gallery, a shop in Halifax. You could look it up. He stared at me for a long moment. The certainty he'd always carried, the settled, unquestioned conviction that he understood my limits, flickered. Ma, he said. You don't have to do this. I know, I said. It's rather the point. I walked back to the wheel to get my bag, and when I turned around, he was still standing there, and I thought, he came here expecting to find someone struggling, someone grateful to be offered an exit, and instead he found a woman with clay on her forearms who had just finished making something she was proud of. He left, without saying anything else. The legal settlement came through the following autumn. Isabel had done extraordinary work. The undisclosed accounts, the forged signatures, the property transaction that bore my name without my knowledge, all of it had factored into an outcome that was considerably more equitable than Roland had anticipated. He'd spent months, apparently, telling his solicitor that I would settle for whatever was offered, because I wouldn't understand the numbers well enough to push back. He was wrong about that, too. The morning the settlement was finalized, I drove to Miriam Adesola's shop. It was a Tuesday, overcast, the harbor gray and low under October clouds. I walked in and Miriam looked up from behind the counter and I said, I'd like to talk about something bigger. She took off her glasses. How much bigger? I've been thinking about a studio space. Somewhere I could work and teach. Classes for beginners. Maybe for older women specifically. Women who gave something up and want to find it again. Miriam was quiet for a moment. Do you have funding? I have a settlement. She looked at me with the particular quality of attention she brought to pottery, appraising but warm, interested in what was actually there, rather than what she'd expected. I know someone who invests in small creative businesses, she said. She's been looking for something with community roots. She paused. Do you want me to make a call? Her name was Dr. Priscilla Maduka, and she arrived at the Arts Center 2 weeks later, wearing a beautifully tailored coat and carrying a coffee thermos and taking up exactly as much space as she needed to. She walked through the studio, looked at my work on the drying shelves, asked me 3 pointed questions about capacity and overhead, and what I meant by community-focused. Then she sat down across from me at the work table with her hands folded. You built this skill over a lifetime, she said. Then you let someone convince you it wasn't worth anything, and now you're rebuilding. That's one way to say it, I said. What's another? I thought about this. I think I just ran out of patience for a smaller life. Dr. Maduka smiled. Not broadly, but with real warmth. That's the version I'd use if I were you. She picked up a small bowl I'd left on the table, turned it over in her hands. We talked for 2 hours. Before she left, she handed me a card and said, I'll need a business plan, nothing elaborate, just honest numbers and honest vision. I worked on it for 3 weeks. I sat at my kitchen table every evening and wrote and revised and asked Philippa on the phone to read sections back to me and tell me if they sounded real. They did. Or they became real in the writing. Dr. Maduka called on a Thursday morning. I remember because I was on my way out the door for studio time, and said she was in. The studio opened in May, on a street in Dartmouth 2 blocks from the water. I named it Rim and Shore. Small, warm, exposed brick, a row of wheels along one wall, drying shelves on another, and in the front, a small display area for finished work. The sign above the door was painted in the blue-green of the bowl from my kitchen windowsill, which now sat on a small shelf in the studio entrance. Philippa flew in from Toronto for the opening. She stood in the doorway looking around and pressed both hands to her mouth, and then started crying, and I told her to stop it immediately, and she absolutely did not. My first classes were modest. 6 students in an 8-week beginner's session, all women over 50. One had just retired and didn't know what to do with her mornings. One was recovering from a health scare and wanted something that required full attention in a quiet, physical way. One told me on the first day that her husband thought she was wasting her time and she'd come anyway. I told her she'd made exactly the right decision. Within 3 months, the waiting list for sessions was longer than the sessions. I hired Oscar part-time to help with overflow classes on the days I had too many students to manage alone. We started a 6-week course called First Time Back, specifically for women who had set aside a creative practice and wanted to return to it. It filled immediately every session we offered. The shop moved more of my work as my output improved, and my name began to mean something to the people who came looking for local handmade pieces. A regional design magazine ran a short feature. Not on me personally, on the studio, on what it represented. A woman in New Brunswick read it and emailed to ask if we offered weekend intensives. We do now. Curtis and Amber came to visit in the summer, several months after the opening. Amber walked slowly around the studio, touching the edge of a finished bowl here, a cup there, and I watched her face change the way faces change when they understand something for the first time. Curtis stood in the doorway of the small workshop where the wheels were, looking at everything. He'd been quieter than usual all morning, and I hadn't pushed it. "This is really good, Mum," he said finally. "Thank you." He looked at me directly. "I mean, this is really, genuinely good." I understood what he was saying. He wasn't complimenting the studio. He was recalculating something. The version of me he'd grown up with, his father's version, really, and the version standing in front of him now, seeing the distance between them. "Dad called me last month," he said after a while. I waited. He sounded, I don't know, not like himself. Curtis hesitated. He said he made mistakes. I nodded, slowly. "Did he say that to you?" "Not in those words." Curtis rubbed the back of his neck. "I think he thought you'd. I don't know what he thought. That you'd come back, maybe. Or that things would look a certain way after. Instead, they look like this," I said. Curtis looked around the studio again. "Yeah. We had dinner together that evening, the three of us, at a restaurant near the harbor. Amber told me she'd been thinking about going back to work. She'd taken a leave of absence years ago and kept extending it, and she was starting to feel the particular restlessness of someone who hasn't been fully themselves in a while. I told her I thought she should do it. She looked at me. "Did it feel impossible at first?" "Completely," I said. It felt like the most naive thing I'd ever attempted. But naive and impossible aren't the same thing, and I kept confusing them. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I kept waiting for it to feel safe first." "It doesn't," I said. "You go anyway." Roland wrote me a letter in October. Not an email, a handwritten letter on good paper in the precise cursive I'd watched him use to sign documents for 30 years. My name at the top. No return address on the envelope. He wrote that he'd spent a long time believing that caring for someone meant arranging the world in a way they could be managed within it. He wrote that he understood now this was not caring. He wrote that he had watched, through second-hand accounts, what I'd built, and that it had forced him to reconsider what he'd actually believed about me versus what it had been convenient for him to believe. He asked if I would be willing to meet. I read the letter 3 times. Then, I put it in the drawer of the kitchen table and thought about it for a week. I'm not going to tell you, I felt nothing reading it. I felt something that was complicated and sad. Grief, maybe, for 2 people who might have been different to each other if circumstances had been different. Love doesn't always die cleanly. Sometimes it just changes shape into something that no longer helps either person. But I want to be clear. I no longer needed him to apologize in order to move forward. I'd been moving forward for over a year. His letter arrived at a point when my life no longer had a Roland-shaped gap in it that required filling. I met him for coffee on a Wednesday afternoon at a cafe near the public gardens. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table, looking out the window. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically. Roland had always been tall, still was, but in some other way. Like the room didn't need to accommodate him quite so much. He stood when he saw me. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," I said. We sat. We ordered. For a while we talked about Curtis, about Amber's new job, about mild things, the way you ease into cold water. Then Roland set down his cup and looked at me directly. "I told myself that being right about you was the same as knowing you," he said. "I see now that they're not related at all." I thought about that for a moment. "No," I said. "They're not. I spent 30 years knowing who you were according to my version of things. And I got it wrong." I didn't reassure him. It wasn't my job to do that anymore. But I did say what was true. "I think you believed what you told yourself," I said. "That's almost harder to forgive than if you'd done it deliberately." He flinched. Then he nodded. "The forged signatures," he said. "Yes." A long pause. "I told myself it was protecting the household assets, that you wouldn't understand. And now?" He looked at his hands. Now I think I was afraid you'd leave sooner if you knew the full picture. That honesty cost him something. I could see it. And I won't say it meant nothing, because it didn't. It meant something. Just not something that changed what had happened, or what was still true. We sat there until the coffee went cold. Outside, people moved along the path through the gardens, and leaves were coming down in the October light, and I thought about how strange it is that the end of something and the beginning of something else can look exactly the same from the outside. Are you happy? Roland asked before we left. I thought about the question carefully, the way I've learned to think about things I once answered too quickly. I don't know if happy is quite the word, I said. I think I'm present. I think I know who I am when I wake up in the morning. And after 31 years of not being entirely sure, that feels like something very close to wealth. He nodded slowly. That's what I took from you, he said quietly. The being sure. Yes, I said, it was. Rim and Shore has been open for 2 years now. We have 3 regular instructors, a waiting list that runs 8 weeks out, and a community that includes women from 24 to 79. Last spring, we launched a subsidized program for women in transitional circumstances, leaving long relationships, starting over after loss, re-entering life after years of caretaking. The demand was more than we'd anticipated. I'm not surprised anymore when things like that happen. My work is in 4 shops across Nova Scotia and 1 in PEI. Miriam Adesola and I have coffee most Tuesdays, and she is one of my closest friends. Philippa came back in the spring, and we went to Cape Breton for 5 days and stayed in a small inn near the Cabot Trail, and I spent an entire afternoon on a headland just watching the ocean with no agenda whatsoever. And it was one of the most extraordinary things I have done in recent memory. Curtis calls regularly now. Amber did go back to work, into project management, and she sounds more like herself every time I see her. The relationship between the 3 of us is quieter and more honest than it was when Roland was the gravitational center everything else orbited. I don't think much about what Roland said in that kitchen in November, about surviving without him. Not because I've forgotten it, I haven't, but because it no longer carries any charge. It's just information now. A sentence someone said that turned out to be wrong in the most clarifying way possible. Roland believed I needed him to survive, and in the absence of him, I found out who I actually was, which turned out to be a woman who could make something from the earth with her hands, and teach other women to do the same and build a studio and a community and a life that is, in every way that matters, completely my own. He thought I wouldn't last 6 months. I just signed a lease for our 2nd location. If this story stayed with you in any way, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to find out who you really are. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to rebuild yourself after someone made you feel like you were less than you were? Where in Canada are you watching from tonight? And what time is it there? I read every single one.